All right, welcome back everybody. Thank you for joining us for the third event in our speaker series titled Gender Performance in Islamicate Contexts. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing you to Dr. Kayla Wheeler, who is an assistant professor of gender and diversity studies at Xavier University in Cincinnati, Ohio. Dr. Wheeler completed her PhD in religious studies with a concentration in Islam in America at the University of Iowa in 2017. Dr. Wheeler is an expert in contemporary Black Islam, African-American religious history, and material religion. She's currently writing a book called Fashioning Black Islam, Race, Gender, and Belonging in the Ummah, which provides history of Black Muslim fashion beginning in the 1930s. Dr. Wheeler is also the curator of the Black Islam syllabus, which is amazing, which I use all the time. She's also the PI for the Oral History and Ephemera Archive at the Center for the Study of Religion and the City at Morgan State University in Baltimore, Maryland. And so today, Dr. Wheeler will introduce us to fashion in Black Muslim culture in the United States. The title of her talk is Covered Girls, The History of Black Muslim Fashion in the United States. So I'll give the floor over to you, Dr. Wheeler. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me, and I'm going to try to share my screen, hopefully. This evening's talk is coming from my book manuscript, Fashioning Black Islam, Race, Gender, and Belonging. Before I begin, I want to provide a brief overview of my book, which will help contextualize the talk. My book explores what I call the Afro-Islamic diaspora, Afro-Islamic fashion diaspora in the United States. I use archival analysis of Black Muslim journals and magazines, face-to-face ethnography, digital ethnography of e-boutiques, YouTube channels, and Facebook groups. This Afro-Islamic diaspora fashion industry draws from and competes with the mainstream Western fashion industry and the broader Islamic modest fashion industry. The Afro-Islamic diaspora fashion industry has facilitated the creation of a unique Black American aesthetic that is rooted in what anthropologist Suad Abdul Kabir calls Muslim cool. Kabir defines Muslim cool as a means of redemption and a form of embodied resistance that focuses on creativity, improvisation, and reconnecting with lost histories, practices, and symbols. Muslim cool is a form of knowledge of self that questions what gets counted as Islam by reviving old practices and histories to create a new understanding of modern African American practices. For Black American Muslims, that has historically meant decentering the Middle East and North Africa. In my book, I make three main arguments. First, I argue that Black Muslim women use fashion to create alternative Islamic femininities that resist Eurocentric beauty norms and hegemonic Islam. I developed the term hegemonic Islam in my dissertation on Black Muslim fashion YouTubers. It consists of three parts: Sunni centrism, Arab centrism, and an emphasis on textualism. Hegemonic Islam privileges Arab expressions of Islam as the most authentic form of Islam based on the belief that the geographic or cultural proximity to the Prophet Muhammad's native land dictates one's religiosity. Finally, it emphasizes an androcentric process of knowledge production and transmission that privileges Arabic texts as the main source of knowledge and relies on a regulated one-to-many learning model. We see hegemonic Islam articulated in Muslim leadership, being largely non-Black in the United States, in the expectation that Muslim converts or reverts should change their name to an Arabic name, and in the fact that local Arab dress practices have been transformed into the standard by which people's beauty is measured across the world. Hegemonic Islam is naturalized as true Islam, and I'm putting that in air quotes, and marginalizes those who do not fit within its framework. The second argument I make in my book is that fashion provides Black women with the means of producing alternative modes of knowledge production and transmission centered on embodiment. Finally, I argue that social media facilitates a transnational network of belonging between women who participate in the Afro-Islamic diaspora fashion industry. My research is rooted in Black feminist studies, fashion studies, and lived religion. I position my work as a challenge to hegemonic Islam, which dominates the field of Islamic studies. Black Islam is often pushed to the margins in the study of Islam, despite the fact that the first Muslims here in the United States, where I'm located, were enslaved Africans, and the fact that African Americans make up one of the largest ethnic groups among Muslim Americans. I resist textualist approaches to the study of religion, where the essence of religious practice is supposed to lie in sacred texts, which I argue is evidence of Protestantism's lasting influence on the field of religious studies. Instead, I focus on Black women's everyday lived realities. By doing so, I center the voices that have been pushed to the periphery. I privilege YouTube, beauty vlogs, boutiques, and runway shows as sites of Islamic knowledge rather than the Quran. I center English-speaking Black women as knowledge creators rather than learned male elite. Fashion studies allows us to see covered Muslim women as fully actualized people and to discuss their dress practices as part of a larger process of ethical self-making. My book project is about more than just beautiful women and pretty clothes. It's also about how race, gender, normativity, and morality are played out in everyday life. I provide an intersectional analysis that considers how racial hierarchies are reproduced and challenged through Muslim women's fashion. Moving beyond looking at religious motivations for covering, I focus instead on how Black Muslim women cover and what new identities are produced through their dress practices, which allows me to ask new questions that recognize the diversity of experience and the multiple negotiations Muslim women must undertake when choosing their outfits. So there are three central questions that drive my research. One is what constitutes modest dress? Two, how do race, ethnicity, and space impact what dress practices are coded as Islamic? And three, what does Blackness look like in relation to Islam? I try to answer some of those questions throughout this talk. So I will start with a brief history of the Nation of Islam, which was founded in Detroit, Michigan. I know not all Muslims, Black Muslims in the United States are members of the Nation of Islam. The nation actually represents a minority group among Black Muslims, but the nation is central to understanding how fashion became so important to Black Muslims in the US and beyond. So after I give a brief overview of the Nation of Islam, then I will describe the Muslim girls' training uniform and how its establishment opened the door for the creation of the Afro-Islamic diaspora fashion industry. After that, I'll talk about the rise of Muslim fashion shows, focusing on the Sealed Nectar fashion show, the longest continually operating Muslim organized fashion show in the United States. And finally, I'll highlight some of the structural barriers that have prevented many African-American Muslims from entering the rising mainstream modest fashion industry, as well as just the general Western fashion industry that has started to pay attention to modest dress since at least 2016. So throughout my presentation, I argue that through their dress practices, Black Muslim women challenge white supremacist beauty standards, as well as Arab centrism in American Islam. For Black Muslim women, fashion has become a space for community building, as well as promoting entrepreneurship and economic empowerment. So, while not all Black American Muslim fashion designers, models, or tastemakers are members of the Nation of Islam, they are indebted to the organization for creating a blueprint for Islamic fashion in the United States. From its inception, clothing has always played an important role in the Nation of Islam. W.D. Farad Muhammad, the founder of the Nation of Islam, met many of his followers during his day job, selling raincoats and silk as a door-to-door salesman. He told potential customers that the silks he sold were the same kind that their people used to wear in their native country, where he had traveled from to share the truth with his Negro brothers and sisters. He invited listeners to hear his message at a local meeting hall. He would begin the speeches at the meeting hall, almost always the same, stating, "My name is W.D. Farad, and I come from the holy city of Mecca. More about myself I will not tell you yet, for the time has not yet come. I'm your brother. You have not yet seen me in my royal robes." According to Farad Muhammad, Black people in the Americas, or Asiatic Blacks, as his members often identify themselves as, were members of the lost tribe of Shabazz, whose unique Asiatic language, religion, and cultural practices were forgotten during enslavement. Because Farad Muhammad met most of his followers at his day job, many of the first Nation of Islam members, who are known as pioneers, were women. They were attracted to the nation's emphasis on racial uplift and Farad Muhammad's gender ideology. Women in the Nation of Islam sought to disrupt what Patricia Hill Collins calls the controlling narratives of Black womanhood, which have been used to justify their marginalization. So just briefly, those three controlling narratives are the Mammy, the Jezebel, and Sapphire. Respectively, those tropes can be described as the asexual caretaker who neglects her own children to take care of whites, the hypersexual man-eater whose animal-like urges masculinize her, and the Black matriarch who emasculates Black men. These narratives circulated in both the mainstream media and in academia have had material consequences for Black women's well-being. In place of these stereotypical images, the Nation of Islam positioned Black women as the original woman, the blueprint for all women. The nation provided Black women with the femininity and respectability that white supremacy had denied them. According to official NOI doctrine, not only had Black people forgotten their original structure, their original language, religion, and history during the transatlantic slave trade, they had also forgotten the original structure of their society and the role women played in it. The organization helped them recover their lost identities by providing them with new names, aesthetics, worldviews, and politics that distanced themselves from the racist images of rural poverty, as many of their early members were either Southern migrants or Caribbean immigrants. Women in the nation engaged in the politics of respectability by focusing on proper grooming, cleanliness, and Victorian modesty, much like the Black Baptist church women that Evelyn Higginbotham Brooks studied. And dress played a central role in nation women's identity reclamation. So according to the Nation of Islam teachings, modesty is the natural state of Black women and other women of color and had been prevalent throughout most of the world until the early 20th century. Women members in the nation saw immodest dress as not only a personal failure, but also a symptom of society's moral decay, which had large sweeping consequences for its citizens. Marjorie Hussein linked the Great Depression to its changes in dress norms. She wrote in the Muhammad Speaks, which was the official journal of the Nation of Islam, that, quote, the shorter, almost knee-length dress walked in the 1920s hand in hand with the Depression, breadlines, and stock market crash, a sign of Americans' national condition. End quote. For Black people to become financially successful, they must first see themselves as civilized people and act accordingly. For Black women, this meant not only dressing modestly, but also being well-groomed, neat, and aesthetically pleasing, as well as taking on feminine characteristics such as walking with poise, speaking softly, and displaying good manners. Modest dress helped to civilize society and spiritually cleanse individual souls. And another editorial, Marguerite Hussein writes, quote, with the words of truth, Messenger Muhammad cleanses us spiritually and enables the women in Islam to wage a constant fight against the physical, spiritual, and moral pollution of the enemy environment, the world of the white race and its filthy civilization, end quote. Like their Black Muslim contemporaries, members of the Moorish Science Temple of America and the Ahmadiyya community, the nation's early dress practices drew inspiration from the imagined Islamic East. They took many forms, including wearing satin robes and silk turbans with crescent pins, usually in red, green, or white, which was viewed as the official colors of Islam. Women in the nation were encouraged to wear extravagant clothing that showed how financially successful the organization was, even during the Great Depression. As the nation grew to prominence, they began developing a distinguishable women's attire, which you can see in these two pictures on the left and in the right. In fact, by the mid-1960s, the official NOI message prohibited members from wearing Afrocentric clothing. So this is an organization that prided itself on reclaiming Blackness, but also wanted to distance itself from Afrocentricity. So in a speech entitled Warning to MGT and GCC Classes, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad stated, quote, no style of dress is to be worn, but the style of real Muslim people, and the one that I am offering you. The headpiece of traditional and tribal African people who are other than believers of Islam is also forbidden to you, end quote. In his book, The Fall of America, Elijah Muhammad went even further, stating, quote, "The Black man in America accepts the jungle life, thinking that they would love to get to Black Africa. A Black brother and a Black sister wearing savage dress and hairstyles will not get you love of Africa. The dignified people of Africa are either Muslims or educated Christians," end quote. Nation members were prevented from wearing Afrocentric clothing or hairstyles, which Elijah Muhammad believed was uncivilized and not the natural state of Black people. But why, during the rise of the Black Power movement, which in part was inspired by the Nation of Islam, did Elijah Muhammad instruct his followers to turn away from sub-Saharan Africa? So it would be easy to pass these comments off as just examples of anti-Blackness within Islam, the Nation of Islam. And while it certainly is, as religious studies scholar Edward E. Curtis IV notes, this organizational distancing was also an attempt to position the Nation of Islam as connected to all people of color in the world, not just Black people. The nation wanted to inherit the entire world, not just the African continent. Additionally, as a growing organization, it was important for them to distinguish their members from other Black American organizations. And so one way to do that was to institutionalize the MGT uniform, which you see in its final version right here on my right. So the MGT uniform played an important role in communicating the Nation of Islam's commitment to Black self-determination and Black pride. The uniform included a long skirt that stopped 2 inches above the ankle, a high collar blouse with sleeves that stopped below the elbows, and a scarf that left the wearer's neck and ears exposed. It was partly inspired by the Black Cross Nurses, a women's auxiliary group of Marcus Garvey's United Negro Improvement Association. And here's a picture of them in the middle. Many early nation members were former Garveyites and saw the nation as the heir of Marcus Garvey's dream for an economically independent Black nation sustained by thrift, entrepreneurship, and collective buying. Sister Ethel Muhammad Sharif founded the Temple No. 2 clothing store in Chicago and the Temple No. 2 clothing factory. The Nation clothing factories and clothing stores proved to be one of the organization's most lucrative ventures. The stores sold jewelry, shoes, and modest everyday wear in addition to the uniforms, which were purchased by both Muslims and non-Muslims alike. Women were encouraged to buy their uniforms directly from a temple clothing factory or store as a means of keeping wealth within the Black Muslim community. The uniforms produced in the factories and sold in the accompanying stores ranged in price from $25 to about $40. And so women were encouraged to have at least 2 uniforms to ensure that they always had one that was clean. For the nation's members, many of whom were poor or working class, these prices made the official uniform unattainable. And so this opened the door for Muslim women to draw on the sewing and dressmaking skills that they had developed through their weekly educational classes at local temples to create knockoffs for themselves and their families. Some women proved to be skilled enough seamstresses that they were able to monetize their skills and sell imitations of the uniform to other nation members. There was also, in addition to the uniform, a growing market for everyday modest clothing. Outside of the temple events, Muslim women were still expected to dress modestly, wearing long skirts or loose-fitting pants and tops that covered their cleavage and their arms down to their elbows. Many women started small fashion lines in their homes, working on pieces while their children were at school or sleeping. These small businesses provided much welcome income to their families while upholding gender ideologies that position men as working outside of a home and women remaining in the domestic sphere to care for their families, as many of the nation's poorest members could not afford to survive just on one income. The Honorable Elijah Muhammad celebrated these small businesses as proof of the nation's ability to lift Black people out of poverty, transforming them into respectable, productive community members. The nation sponsored fashion shows where entrepreneurs could highlight their brands and women could stay up to date with the latest fashion trends. Additionally, annual, regional, and national unity bazaars gave women in the nation an opportunity to display and sell their products to the broader Nation of Islam community, which were highlighted in the Muhammad Speaks and other Black-led journals. Women in the Nation of Islam continue to play an important role in the Islamic fashion industry today, most notably Carmen Mohammed, the founder of Anisa Designs, who has been the only Black American designer to participate in Torino Fashion Week until just last year. So following the death of the Honorable Elijah Muhammad in 1975, his son, who would become known as Imam W.D. Muhammad, took over the Nation of Islam. Imam Muhammad retained his father's commitment to transnationalism, but shifted his focus to West, Central, and East Africa. This geographical shift can be seen in the members' name changes from Asiatic Blacks to Bilalians in honor of Bilal ibn Rabah, one of the Prophet Muhammad's closest companions and the first muezzin. By focusing on Bilal, Imam Muhammad was making a historical connection to Black Africanness and Islam that could be traced back to the Prophet Muhammad. He reworked some Nation of Islam theology, but retained the idea that Black people were some of the original Muslims. He encouraged its members to embrace their African heritage. Additionally, Imam Muhammad relaxed women's dress requirements and got rid of dress inspections that took place in the temple, in which members who did not meet the NOI standards for grooming and cleanliness or proper dress could be fined or suspended from participating in temple activities. In a Bilalian news editorial, and this was the journal that was originally known as Muhammad Speaks, he wrote, quote, "In Chicago, we have no problem with sisters dressing unbecomingly. The sisters dress in the best way. We have membership there that I'm proud of, but we don't, as they say, strain at a gnat and swallow a camel. We don't do that anymore. We don't throw people out for coming in with dress that's not quite to the ankle or for wearing pants. We don't throw them out in the streets and say, you're a sinner, you get out of here. You've got on pants, you're a sinner. You've got on a dress that's showing the calf, you're a sinner, you get out here for 90 days, 60 days. We don't do that anymore." So these two things, a renewed focus on building ties to the African continent and its diaspora, and a more relaxed dress code, facilitated female members' sartorial experimentation. This included both how they styled their khimars or hijabs and how they covered the rest of their bodies. So women in the Imam W.D. Muhammad community created their own unique styles to reflect their commitment to embracing their African roots, as well as to resist calls from non-Black Muslims to conform to styles that were developed in the Middle East and North Africa. Through their dress practices, women in the Imam W.D. Muhammad community were building bridges with West and Central Africans and the larger African diaspora, situating the African continent as a central source of Muslimness. And this bridge building can be observed at fashion shows. So over the course of 3 years, I attended about 10 fashion shows, 7 separate ones in Newark, Atlanta, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., and online. I visited the annual Muslim Convention fashion show in Newark, and Steel and Nectar fashion show in Atlanta, as well as 2 versions of it online. I interview organizers and fashion designers, as well as attendees, to get a better understanding of the importance of fashion in general, and specifically fashion shows to their communities. Each fashion show had its own unique setup. So for more than 30 years, Steel and Nectar, which I'll talk about in a lot more detail, has transformed the mosque into a women's only space for 3 days, and includes 2 fashion shows and workshops geared towards everyday living as well as religious empowerment. In Philadelphia, there was a formal multi-course luncheon with a keynote speaker and local awardees. Fashion show in DC that was hosted by Howard University Muslim Student Association featured a panel of social media influencers and rapper Neelam. In each location, I saw regional differences. And I think it's important that when we talk about all fashion, but especially Muslim fashion, we recognize that it looks different based on culture, based on honestly just like your ability to get certain fabrics. And that was no different for Black Muslims. So in Philadelphia, you see a Salafi influence. In New York, you see an embrace of urban cool. In Atlanta, you see Southern glam, like over the top color and just like big gowns. In DC, you see how multiculturalism affects fashion. What I found common amongst all the fashion shows was an emphasis on community. a celebration of Black women's beauty and their diverse styles, and an emphasis on Black self-determination. I argue that in addition to being a space for highlighting fashion designers and their garments, Black Muslim fashion shows are also a space for establishing definitions of beauty, pedagogy, and community building. So it's important to note that Black Muslim fashion shows emerged largely after the passage of the Immigration Reform Act of 1965, which would go into effect in 1968. It is also known as the Hart-Celler Act. The law ended the United States immigration quota system that had limited the number of immigrants from non-Western European countries. The passage of the law allowed for more Muslims from the Middle East, North Africa, and South Asia to immigrate to the United States. As the racial and ethnic demographics of the American Ummah began to shift, hierarchies began to emerge within Muslim communities. Non-Black Arabs were placed at the top of the social hierarchy based on the belief that their geographic proximity to the Prophet Muhammad made their cultural practices of Islam more authentic. Many American Muslims embraced what anthropologist Suad Abdul Kabir calls the pious respectability, in which non-Arab Muslims shift spiritually, culturally, and sartorially towards the Middle East and North Africa, the perceived home of real Islam. Many Black Muslims, especially those in Imam Warfi Muhammad's community, reject pious respectability and are committed to creating their own unique aesthetics. Even when Muslim women do embrace various Arab or North African styles of dress, they still maintain elements of Black aesthetic culture. As Robin G. Kelly reminds us, there's a Black way of doing things, even if those things didn't originate from people of African descent. So for instance, the Bilalian News did a fashion feature on Fayez Fashion's newest products, formal and leisure full-length dresses, which combine Western styles with the elegance of Eastern Arabian styles in this right here. So Karima Fayez, the co-founder of Fayez Fashions, had previously been a seamstress for Sister Clara Muhammad and designed one of Elijah Muhammad's jeweled fezzes that he was known for. When she transitioned over to Imam Warfi Muhammad's community in Sunni Islam, she saw it as an opportunity to combine American fashion, Black American fashion, and imagined Middle Eastern fashion. So you see more turbans, robes, and just the peasant dresses that were popular in the 70s and 80s. So fashion shows are an important venue for playing out debates about pious respectability, authority, and authenticity. There are spaces for Black Muslim women to provide their own interpretations of modesty rooted in their unique religio-racial identity, to celebrate the beauty of Blackness and build stronger bonds of sisterhood. Fashion shows also serve as a form of visual dawah by providing Muslim women with an invitation to reimagine what a Muslim woman can look like. So one of my interlocutors, Nisa Muhammad, a chaplain, fashion designer, and a fashion show organizer, explained, well, I've just kind of always been into fashion. Go to the fashion shows, try to find clothes that made Islam look even more beautiful than it really is. Once people go to see it once people go and see me, I could attract them to Islam by what I wear and not people looking at me like I'm crazy. So I do not want people to be Muslim who looks like that. I want people to look like me. Black Muslim fashionistas challenge the beliefs that covering is only done to redirect the male gaze. In fact, they create outfits that draw attention to themselves, welcoming both the Muslim and non-Muslim gaze, performing a form of visual dawah, encouraging people to rethink their definitions of modesty and Islam. And this had been one of Sister Amir Wazir's main motivations for starting the Seal Nectar fashion show. She wanted to show Black Muslimas that they did not have to embrace other cultural dress practices to practice their Islam. So these women are pushing back against the assumption that modesty and fashion are incompatible. And so I just wanted to show a brief clip from an annual Muslim convention fashion show that actually features Amir Wazir, just to give you a sense of what these types of fashion shows are like.
I don't think you shared your sound. We can't hear anything.
Oh my gosh, it's not sharing. Okay, sorry about that.
Or is
So,
Wheeler, if you can try to reshare and write optimize for sound, like check that box, it's possible that it will transmit.
okay, hold on. Can you see it now? Is it working now?
Yes, I can hear it now.
Okay.
I went to a couple of sister friends of mine who I know made beautiful clothing. Now, the Tari Hadid and Suku Sahara were going to bring me here. The design was the Tari Hadid from Atlanta, Georgia. That's so great.
Okay, so as you see, there is a lot of choreography in these routines. There's dancing. When I attended Seal Nectar in person, there was belly dancing to Beyonce, instrumentals involved. So it's a really lively thing, and kind of it's a lot different than what you would see at like a mainstream fashion show if you were seeing Gucci or Prada. So even in how they present their clothes on the runway, it's rooted in Black aesthetic culture. So it's important to note that many of the fashion show pioneers did not begin their journey with Imam Muhammad's community. And this is especially the case for Muslims who lived in New York City, in Cleveland, Philadelphia, and Chicago, which have had large Sunni communities dating back to at least the 1930s. Some emerged out of the Ahmadiyya movement, while others were from the Darul Islam movement. And so while not all Black Muslim-led fashion shows are associated with the nation or with Imam Muhammad, many of the oldest and most popular ones are, and that includes the Seal Nectar fashion show, which I want to spend a bit more time talking about. And that was founded in 1986 by Sister Amir Wazir. So Seal Nectar, as I said, is the longest continually operating Muslim fashion show in the United States. It is also one of the most successful annual fundraisers held by the Atlanta Masjid of Al-Islam, with funds going to the local Islamic school. And I found that most Black Muslim fashion shows have a charity component, showing how Black Muslim beauty culture is intimately linked to Black self-determination. Sister Amir was inspired by her experiences during the Hajj in 1984, where she observed the sartorial diversity of Muslim women from across the world. Using her organizing skills and fundraising skills that she developed while working at Curtis Fashions in Cleveland, Ohio, she created the Seal Nectar fashion show. So she operated that kind of on her own with the help of a whole bunch of volunteers for a number of years, until in 2015, the event acquired new organizers and the name was changed to Seal Nectar Fashion Show. Since then, they've had a different theme each year, which pushes designers to expand their perspective and aesthetics. The first theme was Africa to Meet Africa, inspired by Imam Muhammad, and the organizers invited 3 continental African designers and 3 Black American designers to participate. The fashion show is an opportunity for Black women to dress up and experiment with different fashions. It's also a space for Black women to negotiate what it means to be Black and Muslim in the United States. And so we see this being important because Atlanta is both a racially and ethnically diverse area with Black people from the Caribbean, Black people who have their origins in the American South, and a growing West African population there. And so I observed these interactions when I attended my first Seal Nectar fashion show in 2019. And that year, the theme was World Traveler, where the organizers encouraged designers to imagine what Black women's clothing would look like if they traveled to another country and were influenced by the host culture while still maintaining a unique Black American aesthetic. The locations chosen were included Ghana and Senegal. And so each year since they have started, Seal Nectar has tried to include at least one continental African in the fashion show. And it usually usually includes East Africans. So the designers send down their models on the runway, and they also sell items in the bazaars. So thus far, I've discussed how Black Muslim fashion functions as a challenge to white supremacy. So kind of like resisting these ideas that Black women are inherently ugly or unfeminine. And I've also talked a bit about how Black Muslim fashion challenges Arab centrism. But I also want to just make it clear that while Black Muslims might not be able to fully escape the non-Black, the male, or the Christian gaze, they aren't always actively engaged in embodied resistance or even diasporic dialogue. Sometimes Black women just dress up because they want to look cute, and that's a very valid reason. So Black women find pleasure in looking beautiful and being seen as beautiful by other women. They enjoy the process of beautification when done in the company of other women, like the physical rituals of wrapping one's kimar, gluing on false eyelashes, or strapping on a pair of heels. For audience members of these fashion shows, the space provides an opportunity for them to build self-confidence by stepping outside of their daily routine and investing in their inner and outer beauty. At all of the shows I attended, attendees were dressed as elaborately as the models. So you saw billowing skirts, ornate head wraps, bright, bold makeup, and beat faces. As one of the Seal Nectar MCs joked that she could barely recognize some of the women in the audience because they weren't covered in breast milk. And Sister Naima, who is one of the organizers, explained how you feel on the inside exudes on the outside. And for some people, it has to happen in the reverse way. They have to see that they're beautiful on the outside in order to begin to awaken the beauty on the inside, because sometimes they have been misguided about what real beauty is. So they've been taught to be beautiful means to be anything but Black. So Black Muslim organized fashion shows are a space to celebrate Black Muslimness in all its diversity. While social hierarchies do not cease to exist in these fashion shows, I found that organizers intentionally made space for older women, for dark-skinned women, and for fat women and their definitions of beauty. So while many of the models presented on the runways have the stereotypical model look, so being over 5'8" and being thin and lanky, most of the models at Seal Nectar and most of the other fashion shows I went to had models that were the average size of an American woman, so between a size 8 and a size 14. And while they weren't always featured on the runway, many of the designers sold plus size clothing up to 3X. And this is in stark contrast to both the mainstream Western fashion industry and the Islamic fashion industry. Many Muslim designers, big name designers, don't have plus size fashion available. And if they do, it usually stops at size 16. And the average American woman is a size 14. So they're not reflecting most of the American population. So it's important to continue to have these kind of spaces, especially as Black young girls and women have to deal with misogyny in and outside of Muslim communities. So Black Muslim-led fashion shows like Seal Nectar often draw from women across the country, especially from those who do not come from large Black Muslim areas. So Seal Nectar is in Atlanta, but they get participants and audience members coming from California, from Nevada, from Philadelphia. There's a big contingent of women who also come from Texas and have been inspired to create their own fashion shows based on Seal Nectar. And so for many of these women outside of Eve, this is their most important fashion event. It's the place where they can buy new fashions, find out what the trends are, and actually have an opportunity to try on clothes. We see the rise of fashion e-boutiques. So you can go to Modernista, which is a really big one, but you can't try on the clothes. You have no idea what they look like. A lot of Islamic clothing stores don't have models. They're just mannequins, so you have no idea what these clothes look like on an actual human body. And so this is an opportunity for women to create community, but also to try on clothes. And for many women, this is kind of their only social event. So Sister Aaliyah, who organized a fashion show in Philadelphia, explained, quote, "There aren't a lot of events where sisters can go and just have a good time. It's kind of like, unfortunately, some Muslims have labeled fun as haram, and it's not really like this kind of fun we have. No, we don't belong in nightclubs, drinking and dancing on tables, but it's okay for sisters to go get together and dress up and kiki and have a really good time together." And so these fashion shows are a place just to let loose and let down. And in the case of the Seal Nectar fashion show, it was the only fashion show I attended that was closed to men. So it was an all women's event. The year I went, it was hosted in the masjid, but in other years it's been hosted off sites. So the importance of these types of fashion shows really cannot be understated. And a good example of this is what happened and is happening during the pandemic. While many fashion shows had to be postponed or completely canceled, Seal Nectar has continued to hold fashion shows. And for 2 years, they held online fashion shows because so many of their community members are elderly, and Atlanta has been a hotspot for the virus. So the organizers were able to host a week-long event that included a concert, a trivia night, yoga, workshops for women's empowerment, and still were able to attract over 60 women, overcoming struggles with technological illiteracy, poor internet connections, and concerns about Zoom bombing. The theme for the first virtual Seal Nectar fashion show was notable women in history, and designers were encouraged to show off clothes that were inspired by important women to Black history, including Harriet Tubman, Michelle Obama, and Lupita Nyong'o. Each video featured live commentary from the MCs, and despite their best efforts, commentary from the audience members. So after the videos were played of the individual fashion shows, the MCs read off a list of prices, and the designers were able to provide additional details about the garments. So one thing that you'll hear Sister Naima, the organizer of the fashion show, say that this is not just a fashion show, it's also a fashion sale. So most fashion shows, including Seal Nectar, have a bazaar where audience members can purchase garments that have been featured on the runway. Bazaars will include clothing, scarves, as well as common objects like purses, jewelry, cosmetics, books, textiles, and artwork. And so for many people living outside of major metropolitan areas, this is their only time that they can interact with things that are coded as Islamic. It's their only time that they can get new clothes. It may be the only time they can even get Islamic books outside of going online. And so this emphasis on bazaars draws from the large history within Black Muslim communities of supporting entrepreneurship, encouraging Black self-determination, and keeping Black money in Black communities. And what I found was interesting for both Seal Nectar and the second oldest fashion show, which happens in Philadelphia, is that they were fundraisers for the local schools. And that tends to be the case for Muslim-led fashion shows in general. There's spaces for Black empowerment, for Black beauty, but they're also a space for Black community building, and that means taking care of the youth. Oftentimes the fundraisers are either directed to education or directed to health. And this is something that you can see going back to the 60s and 70s. So in my last few minutes, I want to address the growing trends within the mainstream fashion industry. So if you are into fashion at all or just watch TV, I'm sure you've started to see a lot more hijabis on TV, whether it's like scripted television, reality TV, or for what I study in print media. And so this is something that we can trace back to at least 2015 and has happened in at least three or four distinct ways of how the mainstream fashion industry has tried to engage specifically with hijabs, and then more recently with modest fashion. So the first wave was the introduction of Ramadan collections from high-end brands that were usually only available online or sold exclusively in stores in the Middle East. So you had like Mango had a Ramadan line, Dolce & Gabbana, DKNY, Tommy Hilfiger, and oftentimes these models were white or very light-skinned, and many of the times they were not Muslim. The second wave was retail collaborations with Muslim designers to create special collections. And the two most successful collaborations thus far has been Verona Collections partnership with Macy's, which you see right here, which has since ended, and then Hana Tajima's line with Uniqlo, which is now, I believe, in its 7th year. The third wave of Western fashion's interaction with the hijab and modest fashion has been the rise of visibly Muslim models, including Halima Aden, Ikram Omar Abdi, and Khadija Diawara. Before the emergence of covert Muslim models, fashion designers often relied on Muslim celebrities and beauty influencers or used non-Muslim models to market their clothing. And so the fourth wave is the emergence of semi-affordable brands creating their own hijab or modest wear collections. So you have Nike comes out with the Hijab Pro, Gap, H&M here, and then Banana Republic. These have all been met with mixed reviews by Muslim women. Some of it has to do with price point, and some of it has to do with the design of the clothing. So this was for H&M, and it was marketed for Eid, and it has sheer sleeves. Some Muslim women are fine with showing their arms, but in many mosques, this might not be an appropriate dress. The Nike Pro is really expensive. I think the last time I looked online, it was like $50 or $60. It's also ugly, in my opinion, compared to some other Muslim brands. So these four waves mark a major departure from how mainstream European and North American fashion industries have historically imagined Islamic clothing and Muslim women. The mainstream fashion industry has often fed into Orientalist fantasies of the mysterious veiled woman who needs to be uncovered to reveal her sensuality. So right here, this is an ad for Diesel jeans with a woman with a denim abaya who is otherwise completely naked. There's an emphasis on opulence and hyperfemininity in the clothing. The models are used in those advertisements or usually non-Muslim and almost exclusively white. As cultural studies scholar Minhaj Hisham notes, oftentimes items that have historically been viewed as anti-fashion, like hijabs, abayas, and niqabs, can be transformed into fashion objects when they're put on white bodies. And so we see examples of that right here. So I argue that this move towards including visibly Muslim women in fashion advertisements, as well as just catering to Muslim consumers in general, is part of a larger post 9/11 project to redeem good Muslims. In her book, Arabs and Muslims in the Media, Evelyn Al-Sultani explores the ways in which the media sought to counter growing post 9/11 anti-Muslim sentiment by portraying Muslims in positive light as regular patriotic Americans. And so this meant including them in scripted television shows, like having Muslim cops in 24, or Muslims that were being discriminated in Seventh Heaven, as well as in public service announcements. So she argues that by sympathetically portraying the Muslim other, the United States, and I would say Western Europe as well, can position itself as being morally superior, giving the illusion of a multicultural utopia. However, in constructing good Muslims who can be redeemed and assimilated into American or European society, there have to be bad Muslims who pose a threat to this multicultural utopia. In American society, the bad Muslim has almost always been constructed as African American, and I say specifically African American, not just Black. And Suad Abdul Kabir argues that part of that has to do with the fact that African-American Muslims often face accusations of not being real Muslims. They're primarily viewed through a lens of protest rather than religion. Their Islam is inherently political, and in an American ideology, you cannot be religious and political unless you're a Christian. And so I argue that that's why we don't see many famous Muslim designers or models that are African American. We do see many Black Muslim models, but most of them are not African American. So Halima Aden is a very good example of that. How she's usually depicted in the media focuses on her refugee status, the fact that she was born in a Kenyan refugee camp and then moved to the United States. So there's this othering of her focusing on her ethnicity rather than her race. So while this current embrace of modest fashion is a refreshing turn away from Orientalist depictions of Muslim women in Islam, it's not without critique. There are at least three things that we need to keep in mind. First, Muslim women's inclusion in mainstream fashion and the current modest fashion trends do not upend mainstream beauty standards. So even though we're having more Muslim models, they're still young, thin, able-bodied, hyper-feminine women, and that's who are privileged in our society. Second, fashion advertisements and these fashion campaigns create a narrow image of Muslim womanhood and can lead to Muslim women's bodies being further policed by Muslims and non-Muslims alike. So you take, for instance, the Banana Republic, who debuted their line of hijabs and modest clothing. They faced a lot of criticism from Muslim women who claimed that the hijab that the model was wearing was not a real hijab at all, that no Muslim woman would ever dress like that. When Banana Republic came out and said that their Muslim model had actually styled herself, they did not believe that to be the case, because no good Muslim woman would ever represent the hijab like that. Second, we have to recognize that many of these fashion brands engage in fast fashion. So it's making cheap clothing that's unsustainable, and it's usually made by women in the global South, many of whom are Muslim women of color. And finally, we have to recognize that this new embrace of modest fashion is erasing earlier histories of Black Muslim women in the United States who helped build the fashion industry to begin with. So my work as a scholar of religious studies and Islamic studies and Black women's history is focused on recovering those stories and highlighting them for people who are already aware, to let them know that there probably would not be a Halima Aden without a Carmen Mohammed or Lubna Mohammed, and making space for their stories. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wheeler. That was a wonderful, wonderful talk. And there was a lot to kind of go over there. You did an amazing overview of various aspects of it. So thank you for that. So I'll invite the audience to raise their hands if they have a question they'd want to ask it audibly. You're also welcome to type a question into the chat. I'm happy to read it on your behalf. And we can open up the conversation for the next little while with Dr. Wheeler. Amira, is that your hand up, or are you just clapping for the talk?
I'm just clapping.
Okay. Okay, so I'll start us off then. The four waves that you explained, Dr. Wheeler, I'm wondering in your own research if you sort of experienced from within the Black Muslim community various reactions to each of the waves. Is there one that was sort of more welcomed than others, or are they just sort of outside extra to the Black Muslim community in their own self-representations in fashion?
I would say probably the third wave, so having Muslim models, that was celebrated because a lot of the most famous Muslim models are Black. And that doesn't start with Halima Aden, like probably one of the most important models of all time, but certainly one of the most important Black models is Iman, who is Muslim. She's Somali, has a very similar story as Halima. I mean, her father is like a very important religious leader and politician, and she's very public about her Muslimness, but that's kind of ignored because she doesn't cover, and she married a non-Muslim man. But so there was celebration of that, and Halima has made relationships with Black Americans. So she attended the Hijab Fest fashion show at Howard University its first year, and she was on the cover of Essence magazine, the first Black Muslim hijabi to do that. So that's been the main thing that's been celebrated. The others, like the Ramadan collections, the Eid collections, I've seen a lot of shade thrown at that. Partly it's about the quality of the clothing. It kind of looks cheap, even though it might cost a lot. And it doesn't look that original. So if you talk to like OG designers like Carmen Mohammed or Luna Mohammed, they point out like the care that goes into their designs and the longevity of it. I have interviewed women who have owned things by designers for 30 years, and it still fits well, it looks great, and it's recognizable. You can go down the street and be like, that's a Gwen Dewan piece. You can't really do that with DKNY or Tommy Hilfiger because they're just in it for the money. Not saying that Black Muslim designers aren't too, but there's also that commitment to the culture.
And just on the second wave with the collaboration, I'm assuming, as is typical, unfortunately, with a lot of these movements, that there's not been a lot of Black Muslim collaboration with these brands, but you know.
No, there's not. And I think who they have chosen to collaborate has also been very interesting. Oftentimes it privileges white people and sometimes converts. So in the case of Verona collection and a few others, which is fine, but I think it fits a certain narrative about who can be celebrated among Muslims. I think it is very sad because there are a whole bunch of Muslim designers who are doing great things. I don't know why no one has reached out to Ibtihaj Muhammad. She has her own fashion line with her sister. Like, there's so much money to be made to have an Olympian who is a fashion designer. She's been a model for Nike, but you don't see Macy's or Nike being like, let's do an Ibtihaj collection.
Thank you so much. Any questions from the audience? We're a bit quiet today. I mean, I have like 15 more questions for you, but I was hoping not to monopolize the conversation here. We have one question in the chat here. Thank you so much for the talk and your contribution. Do you think social media also plays a vital role in Black Muslim fashion in the United States, with Muslim influencers starting their brands?
Yeah, so I think there's two sides to that. One is it's getting out to the broader public the stories of Black Muslims, and it's highlighting Black Muslim fashion trends. But also I think the more that Black culture in general gets dispersed throughout social media, the easier it is to appropriate that culture. And so I don't think cultures have to inherently be closed off systems, but I do think it's important when you're interacting with marginalized cultures that you pay homage to it, or at least like point out where you got it from. And I'm seeing a lot with the modest fashion industry, which includes not just Muslims, but Christians and Jewish women as well, kind of ripping off Black Muslim fashion, but then not giving it any credit, and then being able to capitalize off of Blackness and get deals. So an example of that, and I don't think she did it intentionally, but Nurafia, who was the first visibly Muslim cover girl, she's a makeup artist and a YouTuber. If you look at a lot of her YouTube makeup tutorials, she's wearing turbans and scarf styles that are more associated with Black culture. But when she got in her cover girl deal, she was very strategically styled in a way that made her more easily read as a Muslim. So I think that happens a lot. I know a few years ago, there was a trend of Muslim women wearing like do-rags as hijabs. with kind of no interrogation of where that comes from. So this is what I'm talking about with Nurafia. So this is her YouTube account. This is how she is in her everyday life. And this is how she was clothed for the cover girl ad. So I think there's a good side and an upside. More Black people are getting attention, but it's also opening up for more Black people to have their work stolen.
Dr. Wheeler, could you elaborate a bit more about the kind of moving away from textual centrism, when, especially when teaching Islam, when engaging with Islamic traditions? So being fashion is material, culture and religion obviously is a wonderful way to do that, but can you elaborate pedagogically, even in your own classrooms, how you teach in a non-textually centric way?
So, and it's weird to say like I'm not textual centered when like most of the stuff I assign is books. But for me, I think if the only way you can show students how to engage with Islam is through the Quran, you're doing a disservice, especially when it's an Arabic Quran. Most of the people who I interview, who I study, don't speak Arabic. So when they're engaging with the Quran, it's in English. When they're trying to learn about Islam, it's on YouTube. And so I think those can be important sites. I think if you are an Islamic studies scholar, you should have like some language competency, but when you're teaching a general class, introducing people to Islam, I think if you just are focusing on the Quran, you're not doing justice to the religion and how it could be taught. And you're doing this very Protestant model where you can open a book and that is how you find out what people think and how they live their lives. That doesn't work well, especially when you're talking about Muslim dress practices, because the Quran doesn't actually say that much on how women or people in general should dress. There's really only two surahs that tell you, two ayahs that tell you. So if you want to get more information, you go to the hadith, but you also go to your own cultural background to tell you what is modest, and that changes over time and space. So 30 or 40 years ago, many people would have said wearing skinny jeans was not modest. Now you go to a masjid, that's a lot of what people are wearing, or wearing a color red or yellow. These kind of things change over time. And I think if you just use the Quran and nothing else, and don't provide a historical context to any ayahs or surahs, people are going to get a very, very, very slanted view of what Islam is when it's lived out by people.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wheeler. Any other questions? Okay, I'll go again. I just wanted to, since this series is called Gender Performance, and you talked a little bit about sort of performances of modesty changing and how they look in various Black communities. So what other markers of femininity kind of take on a different tone, I guess, than the Arab-centric or the white-centric versions in the communities you've been studying?
What are the markers of femininity? I don't know, that's a good question. So, and I don't want to create this divide where like, I'm saying like Black Islam is so different from Arab Islam. In many ways it's not, it's all just regular Islam. What I'm kind of arguing is like this idea that there is only one right way to practice Islam is the problem. And to question why, when people say real Islam is in the Middle East, what are they saying about all the other Muslims, especially given the fact that the most populous Muslim country isn't even in the Middle East. So what I have found just studying Black mosques is the configurations of mosques can sometimes be different. So for Black American, if they're associated with the Imam Wafdi Muhammad communities, usually there's prayer in all one room, men and women praying in the same room instead of having a separate room. If there is a separate room, it's more of a family room where like you go if you have screaming kids or like kids that will be running around. I think, and this is something that you see in early most mosques, regardless of the ethnicity, but mosques that were founded before like 1970s is women in a lot more leadership roles within the masjid. So being the mosque president, being on the board, other than just being the secretary or treasurer. But that's something that you see in non-Black communities as well. I think the aesthetics, the biggest differences would be how clothes are styled, the scarves, what jewelry is used. So one really good way to tell if somebody is from or inspired by the Nation of Islam or Imam Muhammad, if they're Black, is that their ears are exposed. They have their scarves tied behind their ears so you can see their earrings. And that's something that's really Black. But you see that in South Asian culture too.
Thank you so much. And how does it reflect in sort of children's fashion in terms of how children are taught to be a part of that community as well?
So this isn't universal, but one thing that I have noticed in Black African-American communities that I don't necessarily see as much in other communities is having girls wear hijab a lot earlier. So pre-puberty, so like as early as 3 or 4 years old, just so it's something that's completely normalized for them. It can be weird to wear shorts or wear whatever until you're 13, and then one day you have to stop and dress completely differently. So just by normalizing it, by having them wear it every day or just on Fridays, I think it can lead to wider like acceptance and compliance with hijab, but I don't know if that should necessarily be the goal.
I
And
have
definitely,
a question.
yeah, it does.
Sorry, just in relation to what you just said right now. I'm Black Nigerian. I grew up in Nigeria, but I currently live in Canada. I was wondering if how quickly specifically Black girls are asked to wear hijab is in any way related to how Black bodies, specifically Black women's bodies, are hypersexualized.
That's a good question. I never thought about it that way, or even like the adultification of Black children. When I have asked women about that, they've never brought that up. It has been more of a thing like, imagine if like all your life you were wear whatever you wanted and then you had to change. But I'm sure that's part of it for them too, is just recognizing that for some women, the hijab can in their minds be a way to prevent their sexualization. In reality, it doesn't necessarily do that, but that is a valid perspective. But
Yeah, because I see that, like growing up in Nigeria, I see that play out where what we often say is like, oh, we just want you to be used to like wearing hijab. So like when you're like 12, it's not weird. But at the same time, there's always that undertone of like just that undertone of like no like sexuality and being perceived as a sexual being at such an early age plays a role in it. I'm not 100% sure if like that's what's going on, but oftentimes it felt like that was what was going on.
I can totally see that. I think also probably part of that is wanting your child to be recognized as Muslim, so they can be protected. And I think that's especially true like in urban areas with big Black populations. You don't mess with somebody who's a Black Muslim, especially if they're in the nation. And one easy way to tell who is in the nation is how they dress. So there's like, that's kind of like your body armor there. That's your protection. If somebody is picking on a child from the nation, you know that in a few minutes, you're going to have a whole bunch of adults swarming you and protecting that child. But yeah, I think the sexualizing is probably like that is their way of protecting their children from outsiders. I could totally see that.
Thank you, Amira. Any other questions from the audience before we wrap up? Okay, in that case, I want to thank you again, Dr. Wheeler, for taking the time out of your schedule and for sharing your research. We greatly look forward to your book. And thank you all for being here. Our next event is actually our only in-person event this term. And it's also a hybrid event, so you can attend on Zoom as well. And we'll be having Ash Dreisinger with us. And the name of their talk is Ordering the Empire, Gendering Bodies on Queer Rereadings of Hadith. So we look forward to seeing you on October 25th. And thank you all so much. Have a great evening, Dr. Wheeler.
Thank you.
Bye.